What's going on, everybody? Welcome to Common Sense Living, the show where we dive into financial and economic trends, gold and silver, and various business topics. So, today in this episode, I want to talk about the hyperinflation in Zimbabwe that occurred, what and why it happened, and dive into some key takeaways that are essential we remember. Now, compared to other hyperinflation that has occurred around the world recently, Zimbabwe really stands out, and it's pretty well known as the amount of the inflation in the country was just mind-boggling. It's recorded as being the second highest in history, just behind Hungary in the mid 1940s. For example, in November 2008, the daily inflation rate there was 98%. And this may really be understating that number, as the government was corrupt and not keeping accurate numbers. So prices were basically doubling daily. Unemployment skyrocketed to 70%, and the economy essentially became a barter economy. It was so bad, the printing of money in the country was so bad that they ran out of paper. Now, what caused this country, who in the 1980s gained its independence from United Kingdom, to have such out of control inflation? Well, as what we're going to see, the usual reasons are going to be responsible here. So first, right off from the get-go in the 1980s, Zimbabwe had some high inflation. It was high in the 80s, but reasonable. It ranged from 7% to 19%. But the key thing to note here is Zimbabwe at this time, even with the high inflation, it was really an economic success story due to the economic growth that was occurring during that time period. Now, the early 1990s is when things really started to begin to fall apart. Zimbabwean President Robert Mugabe began to implement a program named the Economic Structural Adjustment Program, or ESAP. And the primary objective of this was moving the economy from production of non-tradable goods to tradable goods. So in other words, the program decided to prioritize exports over building a diversified domestic economy. And what's most troubling about this, in my opinion, is that this program was really pushed by the World Bank and the IMF. The program, it pushed growth among large multinational corporations, not small businesses, not entrepreneurs. And again, we see this with large entities like the IMF, obsessed with controlling things. Now, what happens next in the 90s adds more fuel to the fire, and we'll see that allowing the government to have too much power can really cripple the economy. So in the late 1990s, the government instituted land reforms to evict white landowners and farmers and then replace them with black farmers. Now, why was this a huge problem other than the obvious reasons we can kind of see here? Well, many of the black farmers just simply couldn't farm, and food production dropped rapidly. To make matters worse, the banks didn't want to loan to them, so this rippled through the economy. And other businesses suffered as well. Manufacturing dropped, many people went broke, crime and corruption rose, HIV skyrocketed. So food output ultimately fell by about half. And by around the early 2000s, around 11 million citizens from that country had fled. Now, around this time, the Mugabe government, which was just an absolute disaster and hadn't made one halfway decent decision, began recklessly printing money to finance the Congo Wars. So there was a lot of corruption around this. Top army generals were paid ridiculous amounts. Um, we can only imagine the kind of deals that went on behind the scenes. And again, by the early 2000s, hyperinflation was there. The inflation rate was over 100%. The country suspended debt repayments in 2004 and was ultimately kicked out of the IMF. Now, their only path at this point was to print money. They were sanctioned by the U.S. and the European Union. There was going to be no more loans made to them. No one had any faith in what they were doing. And the government actually began blaming the hyperinflation on outside events, on other countries, on the IMF at this time. But life was a disaster for everyday people. Citizens, they couldn't speak up for fear of retaliation by the government. The government attempted to ban inflation by requiring businesses to stop raising prices. And these price controls failed as predicted. Multiple currencies were tried, and all of them failed anytime they tried to bring out a new one. And simply, another thing that came up is that the ATMs couldn't handle the values of the bill since they got to be so much, hundreds and hundreds of trillions. And I'm sure you've seen online as a novelty item, there's $100 trillion bills for sale from Zimbabwe. You can get them on eBay for fairly cheap. So Zimbabwe is still struggling today because of these poor decisions. Now, in 2019, Zimbabwe made an attempt to launch a new currency. It quickly failed. The first year, the inflation rate was 500%. People still prefer to use other currencies. Understandably, they're not trusting what the government's doing there, what they've done in the past. But the government's actually made it illegal to use those any other currency. So here in the US, we can learn from Zimbabwe's experience. Mismanagement, corruption, excessive money printing, those things drove the economy into dire straits. Here we have a divided political system. Politicians move further to the outside. We're seeing this more and more. It used to be the case that politicians, when they wanted to get elected, they would move more towards the center. Now, in my opinion, we're already seeing poor decisions being made with things like ESG, other programs pushed that a large part of the country doesn't support. And that's not even getting into a lot of the social issues. Now, money printing has been way out of control for a long time here by the federal government and the Fed, but it's really taken on a new life of its own the last few years. Now, it's true that our economy, it's diverse, it's technologically advanced, but we have to kind of look at what trends are occurring in the economy and where they are headed. So we're largely a service-based economy. About 70 to 80% of our GDP comes from services, meaning services are provided and products are not being made. And this here is fine and dandy when your economy is growing, when times are good and everything's doing well. But when things get bad, a service-based economy is really going to struggle. And we saw this with COVID. More people are going to cut back on services, things that you can do for yourself, like haircuts. We depend way too much on other countries for goods, and we really need to bring manufacturing back home. Now, one other takeaway from Zimbabwe is how the government intervention in farming decimated the country. We've been seeing food supply issues here already the last few years for a variety of reasons. And one thing that doesn't help our future in farming is having these big investors buy this land, buy these farms, and then rent it out at high prices, ultimately just interested in making as much profit as possible. So the people who actually know how to farm, the people who are getting our food, growing our food, they're being left out in the cold. And there's a lot of talk about this. That's probably something I'll have to get into in another video. But it's definitely scary when you think about these big companies getting involved and trying to run a lot of these farms and things. So that's all I've got for today. I appreciate everyone watching. As always, please comment, like, subscribe. Thanks a lot.